Vienna, 1907, just as the cathedral bells tolled noon across the Hofburg Palace gardens and the scent of lilacs carried through the library's open windows. Nadette Janson didn't look up from the parchment-stuffed folio in her lap until the heavy oak door let out a groan. She had asked not to be disturbed twice, but no one ever listened to the palace librarian when dukes and archduchesses were planning a coronation. "I said no interruptions," she called, standing. Her gloves were ink-stained, and her hair had slipped from its pins. She didn't care. No one saw her except the archivists, and they respected the silence. But the man who entered wasn't an aide or a courier. He wore a lieutenant's uniform of the Imperial and Royal Army, dark blue with gold braid at the collar, and his boots had the dust of travel on them. He looked too serious to be lost. "I'm looking for a volume on the Serbian treaties of 1881, he said, stepping inside without asking permission. "I was told the librarian here could help." His voice was low, clipped, and unmistakably non-Viennese. "Hungarian, perhaps?" Nadette narrowed her eyes. "That's restricted." "I have clearance," he said, producing a folded document with a red wax seal. "Signed by Archduke Otto himself." She didn't reach for it. "And your name, Lieutenant?" "Valen Kray," he said. "Newly attached to the Foreign Office." The name meant nothing to her, but the seal was real. She reached for the document, her fingertips brushing his glove. He didn't flinch, but something in his eyes flickered recognition. No. Curiosity. "You'll wait here," she said, turning briskly. "The archives are locked." She left him by the tall windows and descended into the lower stacks. The Serbian treaties were buried behind a false wall of opera scores and court memoirs. Nadette unlocked the iron gate, drew out the thick leather-bound ledger, and ran her hand over its spine. When she returned, Valen was staring at the garden beyond the glass, where the gardeners were planting white tulips in rows too perfect to be natural. "Here," she said, placing the volume on the reading table. "Do not remove it from this room." He didn't thank her. He opened the book, flipped through a few pages, then looked up. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," she said, then regretted it. A librarian did not provoke officers of the crown. He smiled just a little. "I was told the palace librarian was old. Someone with spectacles and a cane." "I'm 27 and my eyes are fine," she said, crossing her arms. "I can see that." She turned away before heat rose to her cheeks. "If you need anything else, send word. I'll be in the upper stacks." But he didn't send word. He found her again the next morning, and the morning after that. Always with a new clearance, a new document, a new question. And always in the reading room, just as the light slanted across the marble floor and turned the dust into gold. On the fourth day, he arrived without gloves. "You're not here for the treaties anymore," she said, not looking up. "No," he said. "I'm here for something else." She closed the census scroll she'd been working on. "What exactly?" "I need a tutor," he said. "On Ottoman court protocol. I'm being posted to Constantinople next month." She hesitated. "That's not in my duties. I asked for you specifically." The Foreign Office agreed. "Why?" "Because I heard you're the only one who actually understands the court's internal structure. And because you're discreet." Discreet. That word again. It followed her like a shadow. The daughter of a minor American diplomat, raised in Prague, fluent in 5 languages but never quite belonging to any court. She'd worked in the Hofburg for 8 years, and still no one knew where she went on Sundays or why she never attended the staff balls. "I'll consider it," she said. He nodded, respectful. But she didn't say no. They met in the West Wing, in a narrow salon no one used anymore, where the wallpaper had faded and the chairs still smelled of lemon oil. She brought books. He brought questions. At first, it was formal. How to greet a vizier. What color robes meant mourning. When to bow, and when not to. But one day, just as the rain started against the tall windows, he asked, "Why did you stay here, Nadette? You could have gone back to the States. Or East. Anywhere." She looked at him, really looked at him, brown eyes steady, jaw tight, posture always too correct. Like a man who'd never been allowed to relax. "Because I belong nowhere else," she said. His hand was on the table, close to hers. The rain softened the light. She didn't move. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "Do you know what my father did?" "No." "He was a Hungarian revolutionary. Fought against the empire for 10 years. Died in exile." She blinked. "And now you wear its colors." "I had no choice," he said. "I was raised in a boarding house in Pest. One day a man in a black coat arrived and said I could join the army or disappear like my father." She didn't answer. The silence was too heavy for words. He reached into his coat and pulled something from the inner pocket, a letter, sealed in black wax. "I found this in the Ottoman correspondence. Hidden behind a ledger. It's in Ladino. I think it was meant for someone who never received it." She took the letter carefully. "Why bring it to me?" "Because you read Ladino." She looked up sharply. "I heard you speaking it," he said. "When you thought you were alone." She stood. "You shouldn't have followed me." "I didn't. I just listened." She hesitated, then broke the seal. The letter was short, no more than a few lines. A plea. A promise. And a name. "It's from a woman named Rahila," she whispered. To her son. Valen's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. "My mother's name was Rahila," he said, quietly. She froze. "Are you saying?" "I think I was left behind. In Pest. I think she worked for the Ottoman ambassador. And I think she tried to get me back." Nadette's heart stuttered. "This is diplomatic dynamite." "I know. And still you gave it to me." "Yes." She met his gaze. "Why?" "Because I trust you." The clock struck 6. Somewhere in the palace, a bell rang for vespers. Outside, the rain had stopped. "You shouldn't trust me," she said. "I already do." That night, she didn't sleep. Not because of the letter, or the secrets it held, but because of the man who had placed it in her hands. The man who had looked at her like she was more than a librarian. More than a shadow between shelves. Valen returned the next day, and the day after that. They no longer spoke of protocol. They spoke of Budapest and Prague, of mothers who vanished and fathers who lied. They spoke of books and gardens and the way the palace always felt colder than it should. And then, one morning, a courier arrived with a silver-edged envelope. Valen read it once. Folded it slowly. Then turned to her. "I've been challenged," he said. "To a duel." Her breath caught. "By whom?" "Count Lothar. He intercepted one of our meetings. He thinks I've been consorting with a Jewess." She stared at him. "I'm not." "You speak Ladino. You read Ottoman letters. You never go to Massachusetts. That's enough." She swallowed. "You can't accept. If I refuse, I lose my commission. And I lose access to Constantinople. To the embassy. To the files that might tell me who I really am. And if you go? I could die." She stepped forward. "Don't do this." "I have to." She gripped his sleeve. "Then let me help." He looked down at her fingers on his uniform, then up at her. "You already have." Snow fell through the gaps in the colonnade like sifted flour, quiet and unhurried. Nadette stood beneath the arch, her coat buttoned high, her breath blooming in puffs against the early March chill. She had not seen Valen in 4 days. No word had come from the dueling ground behind the Schönbrunn riding stables. No mention in the court bulletin, no whispered updates from the Foreign Office pages who normally could be relied upon for gossip in exchange for a warm slice of strudel or a tucked-away volume of scandalous poetry. She had gone to the reading room each morning, as always. Had lit the oil lamps and dusted the spines of books untouched for decades. But she could no longer focus. Her hands trembled when she tried to write. The silence felt different now, less like solitude, more like waiting. A footstep behind her made her turn. Valen stood at the threshold of the corridor, his left arm in a sling, a thin red welt disappearing beneath the edge of his collar. His overcoat was damp at the hem, his boots streaked with street ash. "I wasn't sure I would see you again," she said, voice low. "I wasn't sure I'd still be standing." She approached slowly. "What happened?" "I let him graze me. Then I let him believe he'd won." He tilted his head slightly. "He won't challenge again." Her gaze dropped to the sling before rising to meet his eyes. "You could have been killed." "I thought about that," he said. "But I kept seeing you with the letter in your hands." She inhaled, sharp and shallow. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because this palace eats people like you. People who feel too much." He stepped closer. "Then what are you still doing here?" She didn't answer. The wind stirred the hem of her skirt and sent a swirl of snow across the stone floor. Valen shifted his weight carefully. "Do you remember the old map of Thessaloniki you showed me? The one with the annotations in Ottoman Greek?" "Yes. I think I found the man who wrote them. He's alive. Lives under a false name in Galata." She blinked. "That's impossible. I have a letter from the embassy's cipher clerk. He says the man was moved during the Bulgarian revolts. Disappeared for 20 years. If that's true, he could know what happened to your mother." Valen nodded. "I leave for Constantinople in 10 days. Her throat tightened. "And you'll go alone?" "I wanted to ask if you'd come with me." "Not officially. As part of the consular library delegation. They need someone to catalog the imperial records in the paraquarters." "You want me to pose as a clerk?" "I want you to be where the answers are." She turned away, resting her gloved hand against the cold stone of the balustrade. Below, the snow had begun to cover the gravel paths. A gardener nearby stooped to brush it from the rose beds, though nothing had yet bloomed. "I'd have to resign my post," she said after a long moment. "Yes. They'd wonder why." "Let them." She looked back at him. "Do you understand what you're asking? I'm asking you to stop hiding behind silence." She studied his face. The lines around his mouth had deepened. He looked older than he had a week ago, wearier perhaps, but also steadier. Something had settled in him. "I'll consider it," she said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded sheet with embassy seals. "The librarian's office in Galata has been unstaffed since last autumn. If you accept, you'll be the first foreign archivist allowed into the private Ottoman collections in over a decade." She took the paper from his hand without touching his skin. "Why me?" "Because you understand what it means to be orphaned by history." Nadette said nothing. She tucked the page into her coat and turned back toward the corridor. He did not follow her. That evening, she remained in the archives long after the lamps were extinguished in the upper halls. With only a single candle burning, she pulled the Ottoman census records from the top shelf and laid them out across the table. Her fingers traced the calligraphy slowly, reverently, as if the names might speak if only she listened hard enough. She found the name Rahila ben Yitzhak in the 1870 registry. A woman of Salonican birth, employed by the Ottoman delegation in Pest. Listed with one child. No name given. Her hand stilled. The next morning, she submitted her resignation in person to the Hofbibliothek director. He did not ask why. He only looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. The train for Trieste left at dawn. Valen stood at the platform in a charcoal wool coat, collar turned high, carrying only a single trunk. When he saw her step from the carriage, her satchel slung across her shoulder, he didn't speak. She walked up to him and held out the travel docket. "I'll need a stipend for Turkish lira. And access to the French archives in Pera. That can be arranged. Then I'm coming with you." His expression didn't change. But his hand closed over the ticket she held, and she felt something shift between them, an understanding, firm and wordless. The conductor waved his flag. They boarded together. The ferry across the Bosporus rocked gently under a sky thick with late spring haze. From her place near the railing, Nadette held the brim of her straw-trimmed hat against the rising gusts. The scent of sea salt and iron mingled with the sharper perfume of orange blossoms drifting from the Galata shore. Valen stood beside her, still in his embassy uniform, though the jacket sat looser on his frame now. His left arm had healed enough that the sling was gone, though he still favored it when he moved too quickly. Neither of them had spoken since boarding, but the silence between them had shifted. It was no longer a curtain, but a thread, thin and taut, pulling them steadily toward what lay ahead. As Constantinople unfolded across the water, its domes and minarets rising into the haze like a dream, half-remembered, Nadette's fingers tightened around the small black folio she carried. Inside were her credentials, her Ottoman translation key, and, folded with care, the letter from Rahila. Valen's eyes followed the curve of the shoreline. "That district there," he said quietly, nodding toward the northern slope. "That's where the translator lives." Or so the letter claimed. "You still don't know his real name?" "No. But I've memorized the address." Nadette didn't answer. The ferry gave a low groan as it pulled into the pier, ropes slapping against wet wood. When they disembarked, she allowed herself a moment to simply absorb the rhythm of the city. Vendors with trays of simit and copper cups of sweetened coffee called into the breeze. A pair of boys chased each other past a donkey cart stacked with clay amphorae. The hum of languages she hadn't heard since childhood filled the air: Turkish, Greek, Armenian, French, and beneath it all, the familiar lilt of Ladino in the mouths of the older women haggling for spices. They made their way up the hill toward the embassy compound. The streets narrowed, the cobbles slick with morning moisture. The smell of yeast and roasting lamb drifted from a bakery's open door. Nadette stopped briefly to watch a woman fasten a linen shawl around her daughter's shoulders before they disappeared into a bathhouse. "It feels like a city that remembers," she said. Valen looked at her. "Remembers what?" "Everything." The embassy, perched just above Tunnel Square, was an austere Italianate structure with iron gates and a manicured courtyard lined with lemon trees. Inside, the air was cooler, the noise of the city muffled by thick plaster walls. A clerk led them through a high-ceilinged corridor to a modest office appointed with a single desk and two high-backed chairs. A side door opened into a long, sun-drenched room lined with shelves of parchment scrolls and ledgers bound in faded velvet. "This is the archive?" Nadette asked, stepping inside. "It hasn't been touched since the last librarian died," the clerk replied. "That was 3 years ago. He left no inventory." She removed her gloves and approached the nearest shelf, fingers brushing over the embossed spines. "Then we start from nothing." "Not nothing," Valen said. "You brought the letter." She nodded once, then turned to the clerk. "I'll need a list of all Ottoman diplomatic staff who served in Pest between the years 1865 and 1875. And any surviving correspondences filed by or addressed to a woman named Rahila." The clerk hesitated. "It may take some time." "I'll wait." Later, when Valen returned from a meeting with the French attaché, he found her cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by open volumes and loose sheaves of parchment. Her hair had slipped again, this time caught in the chain of her reading pendant. She looked up, eyes shadowed but alert. "I found something," she said, voice low. He crouched beside her, careful not to touch the documents. "It's not about Rahila," she continued. "But it's from the same year." A letter from the Ottoman ambassador in Hungary to the Sublime Porte. It mentions a child taken under protection after a woman fled during a riot in Pest. No name. Just the phrase the boy was left with the Hungarians for safety. His breath caught. It's not proof, she said. But it's something. He reached out, not to take the paper, but to steady himself against the floor. It means she didn't abandon me. She tried to protect you. Silence settled between them again, not heavy this time, but reverent. When the bell rang from the inner courtyard to announce the muezzin's call, Nadette stood and dusted off her skirt. There's more here, she said. I can feel it. But we'll need access to the restricted vaults. Valen hesitated. Only the head archivist has that key. And he's in Edirne until next month. Then we'll wait. He walked her to the guest quarters without speaking. There, under the carved stone archway, he paused. I've wanted to ask, he said, eyes steady. Why did you really come? She studied him for a moment, then reached for the small velvet pouch she carried at her waist. From it, she drew out a pressed sprig of lilac, brittle with age. This was tucked into the letter, she said. I thought if I brought it back to the place it came from, maybe it would tell me something. And has it? She looked up at him. It's told me I was never meant to stay behind the walls of a palace. He didn't smile. Didn't touch her. But his gaze softened. You weren't. The door closed softly behind her. That night, while the city hummed with distant music and the sky turned the color of slate, Nadette knelt before the open window of her room and whispered the Shema under her breath for the first time in over 15 years. Not from fear. Not out of habit. But because, for the first time, she believed someone might understand. The courtyard fountain echoed faintly through the embassy's stone corridors as dusk unfurled in lavender and smoked gold. Nadette moved slowly through the archive's western alcove, a lacquered oil lamp in one hand, the other trailing across a freshly dusted shelf of catalogued ledgers. The records had begun to yield grudgingly at first, then with increasing clarity names, postings, and transactions that formed a quiet braid of hidden lives. She paused beside a cabinet labeled in Ottoman Turkish and Old French. Its drawers were narrow and brass-handled, the sort used for diplomatic cipher keys and fragments of coded correspondence. She drew one open and extracted a folded parchment, its seal broken long ago. The script within was tight, slanted, and signed only with the name of Hamdi. Down the corridor, a door creaked against its hinges. She turned. I thought you were still at the French Chancery, she said as Valen stepped into the lamplight. They dismissed me early. The interpreter was drunk. She offered the parchment. This mentions a courier route through Thessaloniki. It's dated 3 weeks after the riot you traced. The timing fits. He took it, scanning the text with eyes narrowed. That name Hamdi. He was a known sympathizer. Traveled under false papers. He may have helped your mother escape. Or tried. Valen folded the document and tucked it into his coat. The consul's secretary granted us access to the lower vault. We have 2 hours before they lock it again. Nadette replaced the lamp and followed him through a narrow passage lit only by the last of the day's light filtering through grated windows. The vault door was iron, its key long and grooved like something forged before the turn of the century. Inside, the air was colder, the shelves deeper, and the records less orderly. She lit a taper. You take the left wall. Look for anything sealed with the olive crest. Valen crouched beside a chest of bundled ledgers, his movements more fluid than the week prior. He pulled free a thick volume bound with a copper clasp and set it on the floor. This mentions a woman listed as a domestic under a foreign surname, he said. She was detained briefly at the Bulgarian border, then released under Ottoman protection. Nadette knelt beside him. What was the surname? Kalash. Her breath caught faintly. That was one of the names your father used in exile. He turned to her fully, the weight of the discovery settling between them. Then this isn't only about her. It's about both of them. A low shuffle echoed in the corridor above. They froze. Could be the janitor, Valen said after a moment. Or someone else looking for something they shouldn't. She blew out the taper. We can't be found here after curfew. They returned the ledgers carefully and moved back through the narrow hall, emerging once more into the main archive. Nadette locked the vault behind them, then reached for her coat. Outside, the city had softened into twilight. The call of a street seller drifted faintly from the Galata steps, and the scent of lentils and roasted aubergine curled through the air. They walked without speaking until they reached the edge of the Grand Rue, where the cafes were spilling over with voices and the clink of glasses. Valen stopped at the base of a narrow stairwell. There's one person left to speak to. Who? The caretaker of the old British chapel near the port. He was a translator once. Claims he knew my mother when she worked for the Ottoman delegation. She studied him. You trust he'll speak honestly? I don't know. But he's the only one who hasn't denied knowing her. Then let me come. He hesitated. It's not a safe part of the district after dark. I don't care. If she saved you once, I want to know who she was. They descended together through the winding alleys, past drying linens fluttering from upper balconies, past a dog asleep beneath a broken cart. The chapel was small, its gate half rusted and the bell tower leaning slightly left. Inside, the air smelled of wax and old stone. An oil lamp burned near the altar. Behind it sat a man with a coat draped over his knees and a rosary slung through his fingers. Valen stepped forward. Are you Elias? The man nodded without looking up. You're the boy. I'm not a boy anymore. No, Elias agreed. You've got her eyes. But not her voice. Valen took a breath. Did she survive? The man's gaze lifted slowly. She did. For a time. Nadette stepped forward. What happened? She made it as far as Smyrna. Took work with a family who owed your father a favor. But after the armistice broke down, she vanished. Some say she left for Cairo. Others say she drowned trying to cross to Italy. Valen's jaw shifted. And you? I think she let herself disappear so you could live without being hunted. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, like the echo of a bell no longer tolling. Outside, the wind had picked up. Nadette tightened her scarf and stepped beside Valen as they walked back toward the embassy. She did everything she could, she said quietly. I know. They reached the courtyard. The lemon trees had begun to blossom, their scent subtle and sharp. Valen turned toward her, his voice low. I don't want to go back to Vienna. You don't have to. I want to stay here. With the work, with the archives. With you. Nadette didn't answer at once. She touched the edge of his coat, just where the stitching pulled slightly from earlier repairs. You should tell the ambassador. I will. She met his gaze, steady now, her voice quiet but certain. Then so will I.